All right, folks. Good evening and welcome to the 8th episode of The Wild World of Bees. I'm Lincoln Best and I'll be your host this evening. And I'm the taxonomist for the Oregon Bee Atlas here at OSU. The Wild World of Bees is an online lecture series you can enjoy from the comfort of home. Through this series, we'll hear from great bee researchers and advocates from around North America and the world, but often with a focus closer to us here in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon. And this month, they're just down the I-5. This series is brought to you by the Oregon Bee Atlas, a citizen science-based initiative to document the bee fauna and floral relations of Oregon. The Oregon Bee Atlas is the biodiversity-focused arm of the Oregon Bee Project. And this is a partnership between OSU Extension, the Oregon Department of Forestry, and the Oregon Department of Agriculture. And the Oregon Bee Project is dedicated to pollinator health in the state. Now, this series is sponsored by the Mount Pisgah Arboretum in Eugene, Oregon, and by the Native Bee Society of British Columbia. You can visit their website, bcnativebees.org, to learn more about their fauna, flora, and local initiatives. Now, we had a funny idea from the Hammer this week, and that was, for those of you that are familiar with Fat Bee Week, Fat Bear Week, sorry, if you're interested in Fat Bee Week, please leave a comment in the chat. Now, please also consider joining us for our upcoming AGM and a bumblebee identification workshop that will be hosted by our president, Sarah Johnson. And the link for that will be in the chat. Now, last month, I had the pleasure of hosting my friend and moderately enthusiastic bumblebee ecologist, Sarah Johnson, and she introduced us to the incredible northwestern bomba fauna. You can find her talk from last month on our Oregon Bee Atlas YouTube channel. It's an instant classic, and please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Next month, we'll be taking a break, so stay tuned for our episode, which will air in early December. Now, this evening, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Lauren Ponisio, who recently moved from the University of California, Riverside to the University of Oregon in the Institute of Ecology and Evolution. Now, Dr. Ponisio is just broadly an ecologist, and she has many skills, but she focuses a lot of her work on bees and their interactions. And she uses modeling, synthesis, and field-based work to investigate those relationships, mechanisms, and functions. She's an advocate for open, reproducible science and for diversity and inclusivity. If you'd like to learn more about her work, I encourage you to visit her website, where you can find recent and timely research about bee population dynamics and fire, as well as plant pollinator networks and how they assemble themselves. The website also has a whole bunch of really awesome infographics. So if you just troll around in the website, you'll find all these cool infographics on there. Now, if you want to hear more from Lauren, you can find her on episode of 124 of the Pollination Podcast. She's speaking about pollinator hedgerows, and you can also find her on episode 563 of the People Behind the Science podcast, and that's really great as well. Finally, just the usual housekeeping. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box that you can see at the bottom of your screen. I'll do my best to moderate the Q&A session after Lauren's talk. And of course, we have a crowd full of awesome bee people. So please feel free to use the chat and network and connect with like-minded folks. And so with that, I'll pass it over to you, Lauren. And there you go.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. Well, Link, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I feel both flattered and a little bit creeped out. It was a little stalkery. I was just kidding. Just kidding. Well, I'm so excited to be up here in Oregon, and just really, I think it's so wonderful that there's this series to talk about native bees. I was saying I've been watching all the previous episodes, and I'm like shooting off all these emails like, oh, I feel like we'll be BFFs in the future. And today I'm going to be talking about native bees in sunflower fields. I'm going to be focusing on sunflower, which is where we do a lot of our work right now. But in general, I'm going to be talking about the wild bees of our agricultural system. I just wanted to point out, if you guys didn't notice, this little bee is kind of like scratching her head. So, to generally get the vibe of kind of pondering what type of agricultural system we want to build for the future. Isn't this fantastic? I love that she's doing that. Okay. And our agricultural system varies a lot in how dependent it is on pollination. On one side of the spectrum, we have things like grapes that don't need a lot of pollination. On the other side, there are things like sunflower or almond that are quite animal pollinator dependent. And when you break that down into pieces, you see that, there's only about 10% of crops or so that are, or a narrow percentage of crops where pollination is really, truly, completely necessary. And those are things like sunflower and almond on that side, over on the right side of the screen. A lot just kind of benefit some from pollination. So berry crops are a great example. So they will self-pollinate, but if you have animal pollinators present, then that means that you get more fruits, like more, like perfect berries. So lots of things that are really important. And then, over by grapes, we don't really need pollination, unfortunately. So in the end, in the US, animal crops are worth about $14 billion. This ends up being a third of our production. So the rest of the third, that like no increase in animal pollination, comes from grain crops like wheat or corn. These are a lot of grasses that don't need animal pollination, but the majority of our nutrients come from animal pollinated crops. And so when I like to give this talk, I usually have people, close their eyes and think of, what is the bee when you think of when you think of crop pollination. So I can't call you out on the fact that you're not closing your eyes, but I do this magic trick where I'm like, is this your bee? And for most of you, this probably is your bee. This is Apis mellifera, or the European honeybee. And it's widely recognized. It's got that kind of like honey-y color, the stripes. And when we think of agriculture, we usually think of this bee. They do the colonial thing. We've heard they have a queen and these workers. The queen is in the middle of the screen there. They have these hives. We have these very convenient little square hives we can move around. When you see them out in the wild, that's on the right of the screen, they form these combs and trees or hollows. And we actually have an incredible long history with this bee. So, funny part with Zoom and going forward. Okay, there are cave paintings of people harvesting this bee from 6,000 before the Common Era in Spain. So, pretty incredible. The pharaohs were really probably the first people to detail honeybee management. So you can see, like in tombs, they have these really detailed ways of, this is how we keep bees. You can actually find honey in tombs. Technically, I guess you could eat it if you wanted to. And it was really the pilgrims in the 1600s that brought honeybees to North America. And at the time, this was not for crop pollination. This was really for waxes, for waterproofing leathers, as well as for making candles. And so, fast forward into like the 1970s and in really industrial agriculture, where we started seeing piles of honeybee colonies along the side of roads, like you might see if you ever drive through the Central Valley, or probably, when pear or apple are blooming. And one of the reasons this is the case is just because honeybees are so darn convenient for moving around. They come in these nice little hives. We can pile them onto semi-trucks. In fact, the design of those white hives is actually for piling on semi-trucks. It's not actually the best design for keeping those bees healthy. So it's really just for convenience. And we can put them out in the tens of thousands, waiting for something like almond to bloom. And then we truck them across the country, They tend to overwinter in warm places. And if you guys want to look more into this infographic, it's from National Geographic. But they move all across the country because they're just so portable and easy to get around. But this bee has its drawbacks. First of all, in the name, it is non-native, and so it doesn't really do the best job at pollinating our native North American crops. The other point I really like to make is, if you just Google "save the bees," you'll get a picture like this. This was like one of the top hits on Google, and that is the European honeybee. But interestingly, this is probably the most successful global invasion of any animal. You could probably think that maybe like fruit flies and rats and other human associates are maybe equally good at invading, but they're on every continent beside Antarctica, and there are more honeybee colonies and individuals today than there ever have been before. Honeybees are incredibly important for agriculture. Our managed colonies are really suffering. There's a lot of overwinter losses. We've been able to keep up with them, but this bee species is in zero risk of extinction. And I just like to make that point. So a better slogan might be like, promote honeybee health, because that is very important. And maybe save the bees for the bees that are potentially going extinct, like our wild bees. So going back to this image of what we think of as agriculture, honeybees are pretty good at pollinating European or Middle Eastern kind of origin crops, like something like almond, really open, simple, easy flowers. And then we can get them out in numbers such that, because we can pile those hives on semi-trucks and move them around, such that they can actually pollinate these crops. But we have a lot of incredible native North American crops. Those are things like blueberries, raspberries. I kind of put a lot of berry crops because Pacific Northwest, very into berries right now. Squash, sunflower, and prickly pears. Prickly pears are kind of a fun native crop. And these all have their incredible native bees that are associated with them. So I know in previous talks, you guys talked about the bees of the Southwest, and you guys met Diadasia, and these are cactus bees, gorgeous bees with often have blue eyes and kind of squished little heads. Some people call them Charlie Brown bees. Bumblebees, we've also heard about, fun bumblebee. They are fantastic at pollinating bell-shaped flowers. So huckleberries, any of that, blueberries, they are the ones that know how to get right into the flower and do the pollination. Osmia or mason bees, these are those shiny, beautiful blue bees you see a lot. They often, will be seen on raspberry and blackberry, all those ribes species. Pepinapis, these little guys are squash bees, super, super adorable. The easy part of these bees is you usually see them with their flowers they're associated with. So if you look into a squash blossom, those are probably Pepinapis in there. And, last but not least, the topic of this talk are sunflower bees. And this is Melisodes, like from the name Melissa, and Sebastra. Both are called sunflower bees. I've also heard teddy bear bees for Sebastra, but I don't know if that's the thing that anyone does outside my lab, but they're very snuggly, so good way to remember it. And these bees kind of fall into two categories. These guys are what's called oligolectic, or they only really specialize on a pollen from a certain genus of plants or a certain family of plant. So these sunflower bees, as you would suggested by the name, are usually just found on sunflower. The cactus bees are mostly on cactus. Pepinapis, you only see them in squash. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, there's the polyelectic bees. This means they are more generalized. They'll visit kind of whatever. And those are things like bumblebees. Mason bees are somewhere in the middle. They kind of go either way. Like some groups are really specialized on Rosaceae, which is the flower of all the roses. So something like almond would fall into that category. Some are much more generalized. Today I've just decided not to call them. They're just somewhere in the middle. So let's focus in on these sunflower bees. And so you're looking into a sunflower, so you've already got this hint that they're probably sunflower bees, and you see these gorgeous bees. But you're like, well, they're sort of honey colored, they're stripy, maybe they're honeybees. And so I want to zoom in on what honeybees look like real quick. This one is, love this photo. I think it'd be a great hang in there poster kind of photo. But this is a little honeybee on a sunflower. And you see she has these flattened plates for wet collecting pollen. And her legs are basically hairless. Her abdomen is also basically hairless, and the bands are actually not made of hair. They're actually in what's called integumental. So it's actually, the plates of her body are different colors. Compare that to the sunflower bees. These guys are super hairy. So they have these crazy, crazy, crazy hairy legs. You can actually see in these photos the pollen that's stuck to them. This is where they collect the pollen. They sort of smoosh their legs into the pollen. The bands on their abdomen are also made of hair, not so much in their integument. So those are two distinguishing features. They're also just way cuter and lovelier. Haha, just kidding. So, if you happen to see a bee, got these, I always say they have like big chaps. It's like they're wearing big chaps. And so they're like little cowgirl bees out there. Those are probably Melisodes or Sphaestra. To tell you a little bit about sunflower as a crop, it's really interesting what we've kind of done to really make this pollination of this crop efficient. And so this is what is called hybrid sunflower. So this is sunflower planted for crop seed. It is not planted for eating. It is not planted for making oil. This is the one that makes the seed that is planted for eating and oil. And basically what agronomists have realized is that if you have a flower specialized on one task, you get a lot more efficiency at that task. So the way sunflower is planted is you have rows of male plants, and these produce pollen, and then you have some rows of female plants, which only produce seeds and also nectar. And so you need bees to fly from the male plants to the female plants for effective pollination. The females produce like a smidge of pollen, but they really can't do much by themselves. But if they do get pollinated, because this female plant is focusing only on seeds, then you get much higher yields. And so that's not a sunflower, that's Hollis Woodard. She's a scientist. She doesn't produce pollen or nectar, but she's also fantastic. And so going back to this oligolecty, these sunflower bees are just incredibly associated with these plants. So you tend to, if you wake up, sort of semi-early in the morning in terms of bee hours, like 7 a.m., 8 a.m., and it's still a bit chilly, you'll see these sleeping male bees in the sunflowers, and they're just kind of tucked together to stay warm. And they're completely docile. And I just wanted to show this little video of me playing with them. There's a little bit of like focus on focus, but I promise it's all worth it. Hollis's voice is in the background. You really can't just reach right into the flowers and touch them. And male bees don't have stingers, so they can't really do much to you. So it's a pretty fun thing to do. You may ask, well, the female bees aren't sleeping in the flowers. Where are they? And they like to nest right underneath the plants, as close to these sunflowers as possible. And they nest in the ground. You can see all the sunflower pollen around that nest. They make these tiny little structures out of mud called turrets, like with castles. And then they dig really deep and build these, little chambers that they seal off full of sunflower pollen. So you have to be kind of careful when you walk around, because there are all these little nests within the crop fields. And I don't have an image of what that looks like, but I have a really interesting video of, this is actually from Torrey Pines. This is really similar to what you see in sunflower fields in the Central Valley. This is from Torrey Pines. We were able to sample in the park during COVID, and so all of the trails were empty. And so the bees just took over the trails. And so you can see them just like flitting around. So they nest in these aggregations. There's seagulls in the background. And then just kind of like jumping into their holes at some times. And it's pretty amazing. So then the females, they have their nests at the base of these sunflowers, and they just go around all day and strip every last drop of pollen off those male rods. And then every now and then go visit a female flower to take, a sip of nectar. And so it's pretty incredible to watch them. They're completely focused on this task. We actually don't net these bees in the field. We just take tubes and put them over them, because they're so completely focused on this pollen collection that they don't even notice us walking up to them. So a little dark, but easy to sample. So in this native North American crop, we can compare the pollination efficiency of sunflower bees versus honeybees, which is actually what is commonly thought of as pollinating this crop. And this isn't work from our lab. This is work from Sarah Greenleaf and from the Logan Bee lab, this guy named Parker. And so if we look at Melisodes, and she goes and she visits one female sunflower head, and then the scientist basically covers that and counts how many seeds she produces. On average, one visit leads to about 28 sunflower seeds being pollinated, with a range from 6 to 70. So kind of high variability, really high range, but in general, a very pretty incredible for just one visit to a sunflower. Savastra, so the other type of sunflower bees, it's about 19. There's some evidence it could be a little bit more, but also very solid work on just one visit to a sunflower head. Compare that to the European honeybee, with about an average of 3 seeds from 0 to 23. So right now, we're kind of making up for the fact that honeybees are not great pollinators of this crop by just putting tons and tons and tons of colonies next to these fields to ensure they get pollinated. But we could also imagine, what would need to happen for us to actually support the sunflower bees in agriculture instead. And it really goes down to this moment of them being oligolectic, them being so tied to the sunflower, which is a crop in this case, and its distribution. So the strategies we think of when we think of these oligolectic bees is going to be really different than the strategies when we think of polyelectic bees, which are much more generalized. And really, it's tied to sunflower. So this is a map of different years of sunflower grown in this area. So each color is a different year. And you see that there's this rotational system. Growers don't plant sunflower in the same field year after year. This is because they don't want the kind of upstarts from last year to hybridize with their lines and mess up their whole seed production. You can actually see this is based on satellite imagery, and you see all these tiny little dots on the margins of fields, and those are probably just sunflowers that sort of popped up by themselves from the previous year. And so there's this rotational system where sunflower is not planted in the same place for 3 years. So, it's an interesting thought when you think of, there are these sunflower bees, they make their nests at the base of their host plants, then the next year they come up and it's definitely not sunflower. And so they sort of emerge from the ground and sort of find where the sunflower is the next year. And work out of my lab by my postdoc, Hamutal Cohen, suggests that where you'd want to be in this landscape is up here. So it's a happy male Melisodes being like, this is a place to be, where there's lots of sunflower being consistently planted year after year after year. So when those offspring that were, their mother laid their eggs from the previous year were in sunflower, they kind of emerge out of the ground, and there's a sunflower field right next to them, so they can go, move over just a field and be set. Whereas, if you look at the other parts of this landscape, there's a lot more patchy sunflower growing year after year. So you can imagine without that consistency, the bees are not going to be able to find those fields, or they're going to merge and there's going to be nothing for them, and they're going to maybe not know where to go. So you can think of the consistency of sunflower in an area. Yay. Another thing is, more and more we're realizing that there's a whole variety of interesting parasites that affect bees. And we mostly know this work from honeybees, which share a lot of their parasites with native bees. And so here's a couple, most of them just look like little dots because they're little funguses, or they reside in the guts of these bees. And then the general take home is they somehow turn the bee into kind of like a mush. If you look at the bottom of the screen, there's some interesting pictures of what happens when these parasites take over. And the way these parasites are transmitted is actually through bee poop. And so a lot of them will give the bees bee diarrhea. So this is like a little bumblebee, and she's flying around, and then, she does some bee diarrhea, and she poops on a flower. And then, this other bee goes and sort of moves it around, and you can see the little dots. Sorry if you guys can hear my cat. I should have closed the door more. You can see these little dots on that purple flower, which is basically like where the bee poop has kind of been moved around. And so flowers are flowers, but they're also kind of like toilets, kind of like bee toilets. So hopefully you'll never quite look at flowers the same way again, because, you know, one bee poops on the flower and then the next bee sort of picks this up and ingests that, and then they get sick. And in our lab, we've been trying to understand what affects the transmission of these parasites, and particularly what amplifies their infection rates. And we found, and this is again led by my postdoc Helmuth Cohen, that as we increase the abundance of wild bees in these what's called mass flowering crops, so that's like sunflower fields, there's crazy resources, we increase the rates of infection. Not terribly surprising. I think we've all learned a bit about epidemiology these days. So, you know, we increase abundance and density of hosts, you get increased infection rates. So, you know, maybe all these little bees should start wearing masks, though that actually wouldn't help because it's transmitted through feces. But one really interesting thing that we found, however, which is, I think, incredibly exciting, is that when we increase non-crop floral abundance, like adjacent to these fields. So this is a hedgerow that's planted alongside a sunflower field. It's a gorgeous hedgerow full of California poppies and forbs. This actually decreases the rates of infection. So something about having that non-crop flower, which you can imagine different flowers have different rates of transmission because of their structure. They're harder for the next bee to kind of pick up that parasite from the previous bee. Having this sort of disrupts that, you know, system of passing from flower to flower in the sunflower. So something of a silver lining. Another part of this really, you know, a lot of times we think of how we design agricultural landscapes to promote bees to really vary between oligolectic and polyelectic species, as I mentioned before. And so hedgerows or wildflower strips are often recommended for the oligolectic species, those that are more generalized, because they, you know, like visiting lots of different species of flowers. Whereas the oligolectic species, we've mostly focused on, you know, the crop, whether it be cactus or squash, in terms of determining their population dynamics. But this result was pretty exciting because it suggests that even the oligolectic species might be benefiting from non-crop habitat because of this parasite transmission disruption. Another thing that's problematic for bees in agriculture goes back to that way that they nest. So if you remember that they like to nest sort of in the crop fields, they like to nest really close to their hot host plants, and they create these kind of elaborate underground nests. And, you know, enter what we usually do to agriculture, which is we till it. So, you know, once the crop is done, we, you know, have a really large machine that goes and sort of works the rest of the crop into the soil. Also, this is usually used for weed control. And you can imagine this is not super great for those bees nesting in the soil. And work done by Katarina Ullman, she's at UC Davis now, she manages the farm, found that this was not in sunflower bees, but this was in the squash bees, the Pepinapis, that there was later emergence of the offspring and lower recruitment due to tillage. She did an incredible experiment where she had these cages, and she had squash bees in each of them, and had, you know, a grower actually randomly, you know, randomize where she tilled certain of these cages and didn't till others. And this is the results she found. So either reducing tillage, tilling at a lower depth is a possibility, and recommended for other things like, you know, keeping carbon in the soil, or leaving certain sections of the field without tilling them that can have higher bee recruitment. Another big thing that I'm sure you guys have heard of is pesticides in these fields. And so neonicotinoids, or neonics, kind of like the cool way of saying that, are used a lot in this area. In sunflower, they're used as what's called a prophylactic seed treatment. And Xerxes just had this incredible infographic that described each piece of how pesticides end up in this area. So you have this prophylactic seed treatment, which means that whether or not there is going to be a pest problem, the neonics are applied to the seed and then planted in the ground, which means that it ends up in the soil, right? So if there's, you know, it can either run off into the water, or it can just be in the soil. Their neonics are also sprayed, not so much in sunflower, but they can be. And all of this ends up being taken up by the plant, which means that it ends up in its pollen, in its nectar. Then on the other side, you know, you have that tillage, which is sort of moving around and creating all this neonic dust, and that also ends up in the water supply. And we have tested just, other labs have tested other just random things in the Central Valley, and it's all full of neonics. And another thing we did was actually test bee bodies, and this was in collaboration with Scott McCart's lab. And we found that just kind of picked a random assortment of bees, and half of them had traces of neonicotinoids in their bodies. And this is likely because they're ground nesters, and so they're really either contacting the, when they're digging those holes, they're sort of getting in their mouth. They're really being interacting with that soil, and in that way ingesting the neonics, or it could be from the nectar and the pollen. We're not really sure what this means. It is very difficult to get at bee demography and look at how it affects them, but it can't be good. It's an insecticide. On the other side of the spectrums, there are things called pyrethroids. And pyrethroids, like this one pictured here, which is called asana, are used in sunflower to keep this little moth larva that eats the seeds down. This is like the other pendulum swing different from neonics. So neonics are not incredibly toxic in low doses, but they don't degrade very quickly, and so they sort of build up in the environment. Pyrethroids are incredibly toxic, and but they degrade very quickly. So it's sort of the lesser of two evils. If you think of like the original, Silent Spring, and where we really, pesticides kind of came to public attention, DDT is really similar to neonics, so that's sort of like not incredibly toxic at low doses. And pyrethroids were what was the response, like what DDT was the response to. So through history, we've kind of swung back and forth between these two types of pesticides. I can tell you from experience, we went to a sunflower field several days after asana was sprayed. It was within the recommended amount of time of re-entering a field after spraying. The growers, of course, always tell us when they spray. And we got there at the usual time. We sat down, we're kind of waiting around. It was one of those great, Davis days where the smoke was blocking the sun, so it was a little darker. And we're thinking, maybe the bees aren't showing up because, it's a little dark. And then we waited there for a little longer, and then we both started feeling incredibly ill. We looked at the symptoms, and we had had an overexposure to asana. So I'm not sure which is worse, but we definitely have to think about how we can build our agricultural system to rely less on these types of inputs. So hopefully I've talked to you guys a bit about how we can support these different types of bees in our agricultural system. It's really heartening to me that the science is out there in terms of knowing what these bees need, what hurts them, what we can do to promote them, both with the ecological species that are incredibly dependent on the crops and do an amazing job at crop pollination. So we can reduce our reliance potentially on the European honeybee and start relying more on these native bees if we can just make agricultural systems a little bit more supportive of them. Polyelectic species as well, benefit from things like hedgerows, like we talked about, or wildflower strips. And so altogether, we could be moving towards an agricultural system that's a lot more sustainable for wildlife. So I like to kind of just, think of these fields, monoculture fields, and hopefully you guys see them differently than before, both somewhat as bee toilets, but also, as this potential resource to support wild bee populations if we do it correctly. And also, sunflower, it's not just restricted to crops, right? You see Helianthus, which is the genus, along roadsides and all over the place, and I always see Melissodes on them. Also in people's gardens. When I first moved here, one of the first houses we saw with our realtor had, those lazy-eyed Susans, and they were just covered with Melissodes. And I was like, it's a sign. Unfortunately, it didn't work out with that house. The bathroom drained into the basement. True story. But they're out there. I see them all the time in Eugene. So as long as you know to look for those hairy legs and those hairy bands, and not confuse them with honeybees, which are also often abundant in systems, but can kind of admire them from wherever you are. And with that, I'd like to thank you guys and take any questions. We have a lab website, as Link pointed out, and a lab Instagram that we're not incredibly active on right now due to COVID, because we're not doing too many things. But yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Lauren. That was fantastic. Let's see here. So I'll do my best to moderate the questions for you. We have a few in the queue. From one of our Bee Atlas participants, Marine Beeshold. What plants did the sunflower bees associate with before the agricultural sunflower crops were prevalent?
Right. So Helianthus is a native, like, North American genus. And so actually, and interestingly, to avoid crossing with wild Helianthus in the Central Valley, they basically go around with herbicide and kind of like kill every last wild sunflower plant. But as it kind of showed in that other picture, that this is wild sunflower that's not cultivated. So you'll see them in other, like, there's a whole variety of sunflower kind of relatives that you'll see them on.
Great. How many different Helianthus are native to the valley, do you think?
I do not know that. Link, do you know?
I guess 5. I have no idea.
I just think of plants like bee food. I'm sure there's a plant person out there who knows the answer. I'm like, yes, the bee food.
Okay, so next year we have a question from Lisa Robinson in Wenatchee, Washington. Could there be strips of sunflowers like the hedgerows to show the newly hatched bees where to go to find the rest of the crop and field?
That's a really interesting idea. And I imagine that would be possible if growers were. So a lot of times in these systems, growers don't own the land that they're planning on. They sort of rent it, and then they're contracted by a larger agricultural corporation, and they're like, hey, can you grow this many acres of sunflower? And they sort of find the fields that haven't had sunflower the previous year, and they grow it on there. So it would need some cooperation between the growers in terms of how to get that done. Right now, there's still a lot of reliance on the European honeybee. And there's definitely interest in terms of the growers in moving away from them, and they're getting very expensive. They have problems. We actually tested the honeybees in our system for parasites, which can also affect how good they are at foraging. And 84% of them had some sort of parasite. So I imagine, I think what happens first would be that growers, there needs to be more messaging from people, regular people, and also to growers that, like, native bees can do this job just as well, if not better, than honeybees. But right now there's a lot of concerns in terms of, like, do we want to put all of our eggs in this native bee basket? Like, what if they don't show up? And so before we can kind of transition away from this reliance on honeybees, we need to prove to them that the native bees can do the job.
Cool. We also had a question from Merrick about inquiring how deep do they till?
It varies, and that's kind of part of it. Is some there's whole classes of tillage, and so some of them is really deep till, which would probably lead to a lot more bee nest death. Some sort of what's called like surface till, just kind of like the top layer, and so that would be better. But it kind of depends on the type of weed pressure growers are experiencing, among other things. I don't know quite the ins and outs of those decisions.
There's a lot going on in that system for those native species, for sure.
Yeah.
From Charmaine, can the bee parasites be transferred to people? If you're touching those bee toilets out in the field?
Touching those bee toilets. I do not think they would make you sick at all. There's no evidence that, like, you could get nosema, which is a type of fungus, as a human. There's also, some of them are more or less transmittable between species of bees even. So there seem to be some that are quite specialized on honeybees, such as it's called Nosema ceranae. And then there's also Nosema bombi, which you could imagine is more specialized on bumblebees. So some are more, it's just like bees, where some are much more generalized, some are much more specialized, but they're not known. So you can rub your face on flowers if you really want to, and probably not get sick. But just to keep it in mind if you ever feel like doing that. I guess.
I'll probably
never do that.
I'll never touch another flower in my life. Let's see, from Professor Weidenhammer in Vancouver. She says, sunflower pollen is very sticky. Do sunflower bees have special anatomical bits for dealing with this?
That's a really interesting question. I know that some pollen, like in the spectrum of pollen stickiness, there are pollens that are just crazy, crazy sticky. An example of this is called Geophytum. And in that case, I know that the bees that rely on that, which are species of Andrena, actually do have specialized kind of hair structures that they like deal with the sticky pollen that they can then clean. But beside being crazy, crazy hairy, I don't know if they have anything more specialized than that. Aster pollen in general is also not terribly nutritious, we think. So it is also kind of a conundrum of how these bees, because it is so widely abundant and widespread, we see why you might get evolution towards specializing on them, but then they also have to deal with this like kind of low nutritional adaptation.
Great. Let's see. Bonnie and Lori have similar questions related to flight distance and dispersal distance of the sunflower bees. How far? What do you think?
Well, we know that bees fly in proportion to the size of their wing muscles. So bumblebees are usually held up as the example in very large bees of the bees that can really fly the furthest. And they've been seen to fly a couple kilometers. So the average, usually we think that over a kilometer, bees don't really usually go that far. There does seem to be evidence that these, like to get a really high demand resource, potentially like sunflower, the bees are able to somehow sense something about where the crop is and then hone in on it. But it's difficult to measure. Work done by Hilary Sardinius, she dunked bees in these fluorescent dyes and watched them fly, like then came back at night. She was very hardcore. She came back at night and traced like where they had actually gone in the fields. And she found that they really do not go far. Once they're in the field, they go in their nests and they go like a little bit, they're very, they like efficiency, right? Like why would you go further than you need to go? But they might go further to actually find those fields. It would be great to be able to we'd have to use like genetics to be able to determine that. But one really hard thing is if you don't get a lot of like population structuring, if you don't have a lot of genetic differentiation between, these bees that are dispersing from different places, you can't really detect much. It'll all just look like a giant population and we don't know where it came from, which is probably would be the case with the sunflower bees. Mm-hmm. I've always wanted to test it though. Keep trying to convince my collaborator and she keeps telling me it's a waste of time.
Chasing those tiny bees around.
They were medium-sized, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. From Bonnie, her 4-year-old Emma wants to ask, why do the bees eat pollen?
So the bees themselves, the adult bees don't eat pollen. The female bees collect pollen, put it in a little ball, and lay an egg on it. The pollen is full of fats and proteins, and that is what makes baby bees. So they kind of convert the fat and protein of the pollen to the fat and protein of the little baby bee larva. So perfect. depending on how good your female, your mother bee was at collecting pollen, the bigger the offspring will be.
That does it. From Bruce, I don't know if he's a viticulturalist, but so he read that there's 3 main grape species grown here, and a North American native one needs pollinators to produce fruit. Mm-hmm. So could you comment on your early graphic?
Well, I think I referenced table grapes. So most table grapes and wine grapes do not need bee pollination. There is that one North American variety that needs pollination. To my knowledge, it isn't grown with large-scale cultivation. It might be in people's yards or kind of more of a niche. I mean, I wonder if it could be grown at larger scales. I'm always trying to have excuses to have to work in vineyards. Oh gosh, it'd be tough. But I would do it. I would do it to save bees. Though I will say one thing that's amazing about Oregon, at least, and some parts of Napa, is that people who grow wine grapes are still interested in promoting bees. And so there has been a movement of planting wildflower strips within vineyards just to have habitat for bees, regardless of whether or not they support pollination of the crop. So I think that's wonderful.
Absolutely. So from John Kang, can the sunflower bees do well on other Asteraceae? And do the bees repeat the use of the dens? Little bee caves.
Oh, well, so it depends on the species of sunflower bees. So some of them are more broadly aster specialists. Some of them are quite specialized on Helianthus. So there are also a lot of other aster specialist bees out there. I mean, if you think about it, Asteraceae, so like, ray flowers are super common. And so there are species of mason bees that are specialists on aster, as well as I think some leafcutter bees. So depending on where you are and kind of what the local bee fauna is, you tend to pick up an aster specialist.
So did you find a lot of different aster specialists in these sunflowers?
We mostly found Melisodes, a couple different species, and the Savastra, which there's just one species. We also got a couple generalist bees. We see some halictids, so those are little sweat bees. So we see them on the flowers. They're okay pollinators. In our area, we don't have a lot of wood or twig nesters because there is no wood or twigs for them to nest in. It's unclear whether that is what is always the case, like maybe that is kind of what the bee fauna was like, or just because of industrial agriculture, we really removed that biomass from the system. It was a really interesting study done in the Midwest by Laura Burkle, and she did a resurvey project. I can't remember. I mean, it was from the 1920s. She resurveyed this agricultural area, and the biggest thing she found that was lost were the wood and twig nesters between the 1920s and when she resurveyed it. So
it's telling. It's a lot of cavity nesters of other taxa are also limited like that.
Yeah. Ground is a lot more readily available.
It is. It can get tilled.
It can get tilled. There's that, but at least they have nest sites.
How would you describe the environment there in the Central Valley with respect to all these native bee species? It seems like, just from hearing about this and kind of looking at the landscape, it seems like a challenging place for a bee to live, even if it is a sunflower bee with lots of sunflowers around.
It is interesting. So I'm born in Fresno, California, so I feel like I can say somewhat negative things about the Central Valley. And
Okay. I've never been there.
I grew up in it. Okay, Fresno is in the very middle of the Central Valley. It's now basically completely surrounded by almond, and that area has only increased through time since I was a kid there. And it's interesting. It's a really complex system because there's so many factors at play, but it has moved towards incredibly intensive agriculture. And this is partially because it's always been that way. So if you go in some ways, so if you go to like the East Coast, people had smaller plots of land always. And so the farms there tend to be a little smaller. There tends to be a lot more what's called remnant habitat. So if you move over to the West Coast, when people were homesteading, they were given huge tracts of land. And so that kind of historical farming style has stuck and only consolidated through time. Yeah, there's also just a lot of pressure to mechanize and reduce the cost of labor. Humans are really expensive, and keep people less work to manage these systems. And so that is all kind of pushed towards this very undiversified monoculture.
Thank you. Let's see, from Ellen Silva, do you have any hypotheses on why the mixed hedgerows might reduce infection? Are the bees oligolectic only for nectar, so they can get clean nectar, or other ideas?
That's a really interesting thought. So there's some work by Laura Figueroa out of Scott McCart's lab, and she actually she inoculated flowers with these parasites and looked at how good they were at then transmitting them. And she found that certain structures of flowers were much worse at then, retransmitting the parasite to the bees. So it could be just having that kind of like almost like a sink for the parasites in the system could be beneficial. Potentially also just having some amount of diet diversity. There is evidence that having just a little bit extra pollen for maybe not the sunflower bees, but the more polyelectic species can make them healthier and maybe less likely to then transmit the parasites. But another study has found this exact same result, which kind of blew my mind. I was like, oh, this is a bit strange, And then we looked, and it wasn't in an agricultural system, but it was in an old field system. This was work by Peter Greystock. So it seems to be a general trend that having some floral abundance kind of dilutes the transmission.
Good. If anyone has any other questions they'd like to add to the Q&A, please go ahead and add those on. And thank you, Emma, again. Pardon, Adoni?
Oh, Judy has one.
Oh, Judy. Yeah, I see Judy's. How many cells can a sunflower bee provision in her lifetime? And what % of the larval bees die from parasites, etc.?
So I don't know if I have exact numbers on the bees, but we do know that on how many cells a bee can provision. We do know that they can provision even multiple nests potentially. So they kind of either make these elaborate with underground nests with lots of cells, or they make a couple smaller ones. In terms of the parasitism, it is incredibly high. So we actually put out not Melisodes or Sphaestra because they nest in the ground, but we put out mason bees. So there's an aster specialist mason bee called Osmia californica. And we put those out and looked at their survivorship in these fields. And I don't know if I can remember the exact number, but they're an incredibly large number of them were parasitized and kind of turned to ooze. Some of them also are parasitized by what are called kleptoparasites. So there are parasitic flies in the system, bombyliids in particular, that will lay their eggs in the bee nests and then sort of eat them alive. And yeah, they really get hammered by parasites. I've got to say, I would not choose to be a bee. It's a tough life. It's if you think about it, it's such an unprotected resource. Like bees, evolutionarily, they're vegan wasps. So, a lot of wasps will collect certain species of butterfly larvae, and those have lots of toxins and stuff in them, and they have to, lots of evolutionary history in terms of being able to consume these butterfly larvae. Whereas pollen is just so open. There are definitely compounds in there that are not super great to eat, but in general, it's just kind of out there. So there's just lots of things will hammer bees.
That's a great narrative. It really is. It's being a bee is romantic on the surface, but ultimately it's just warfare.
Yeah. Luckily, it seems like they reproduce really readily. They are managed to make nests, and the bee populations keep surviving. So at least there's that in terms of being a conservation biologist. It's not like mammals that have all these special needs. The bees are I'm getting some flowers, and
they just work. They just work all the time.
And they're here's some flowers. Okay, I will collect the pollen off this, and I will make a nest.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Now, looking at your map showing the rotation and location of all those sunflower fields, what?
Let's see if I can go back to it.
Yeah.
Is it up?
That looks like an enormous proportion of all the arable land in the region.
So the northern Central Valley grows most of the hybrid sunflower. I don't know if I remember the exact percentage, but it is quite a lot. Good growing conditions for it, and intermixed within this is squash as well as tomato. There's also a good amount of almond as well. Safflower is another one, so they kind of rotate this throughout this whole system. The city, I believe, is the two little cities you see are Winters in Davis.
Okay, that's incredible. We have a couple more questions here. From John again, what factors make the sunflower bees specialists? The smell, the ray color, the flower morphology, the shape of their scopa, or inefficiency on other flowers, etc.
It really comes down to what they feed their larvae, their baby bees. So studies have shown that if you give a sunflower bee larva other pollen, it will just die and it will fail to become an adult. So they really only are able to collect the sunflower pollen for their young. So it's more about diet specialization versus their anatomy.
Great. And from Lisa, this is a good one. Has anyone looked at whether bees dig deeper nests over time in response to tillage?
That's right. You would imagine it'd be a pretty strong selective pressure, the bees that nest deeper. Honestly, the nests are quite tricky to measure and find. So there are some pretty cool people out there who pour plaster down the nest to get casts of them. But in general, it takes a lot of work to find them. And so I don't know if anyone has attempted to measure them at that scale. We also can't really dig in the fields because we don't want to annoy the growers that are allowing us to work on their land. So that is something that they do not let us do. We can collect bees. We can collect a couple honeybees. They'll let us maybe harvest a couple sunflower heads, but we can't sort of dig. So that is a bit of a limiting factor when you're working on private lands.
Yeah, it is. Let's see, from Lori. She says that apparently the sunflower birdseed industry in Canada did really well this year during COVID. Are birdseed sunflowers open pollinated?
Right. So this hybrid sunflower in particular they've separated the male and female lines, and that's why they're 100% pollinator dependent. The next generation is less pollinator dependent because you have the male and female parts on the same flower, and so they can self-pollinate. And so those will definitely get sunflower bees on them, but they're not so completely, in need of pollination. But those are what came from the seeds that were planted in the Central Valley, for sure. That makes sense.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Let's see. We have time for a couple more questions. So, is the negative charge of pollen grains and flowers only relevant for transfer of pollen to the bees, or can bees sense a negative charge of larger sunflower monocrops up to a certain distance?
That's a really great question. I do not know the answer to that. There may be, and we really wanted to study this, as we're going to do this summer. Didn't quite happen, but there's also seems to be evidence that bees can really cue into those male rows, and we'd love them to cross between rows more. And this is actually one of the reasons why honeybees are such terrible pollinators of this crop, because if you're a honeybee, you only collect nectar on that foraging run, and the other one only collects pollen, and so they don't cross between the male and female lines very much at all. And if they do, it's kind of like an accident. And they've actually found that the native bees increase the foraging efficiency of honeybees, and one of the hypotheses is that it actually is because it kind of freaks them out and causes them to switch the rows. But we would love to figure out what is it that they're even queuing into to find the fields. Is there some kind of, is it an olfactory smell of the pollen? Or, maybe it is the electric charge, they can sense that. But really unknown. I mean, it's kind of miraculous. They just sort of emerge from the ground and find the next field.
It is, yeah. That's crazy.
I have a question. So you've arrived in Oregon. What
Sure.
are your big plans?
Well, I am really excited to start working in some agricultural systems up here, particularly because I think that especially orchard crops or like pear or, cherry, like longer term crops, people might be more, growers might be more interested in investing in their pollination because it's not such a, it's not a rotational system. We'll see how that, pans out. I have a grant now from the USDA NIFA with Lauren Hallett. She really wrote the grant, working in hazelnut. So even though hazelnut or filberts, call it here, are not pollinator dependent, there's a lot of interest in restoring pollinators in them. So this is the idea of controlling pest control services via pigs basically pig rotations, and thinking about like cover crops for promoting pollinators, and going back to that question about connectivity, thinking more about connectivity of the landscape versus, right now we're doing what we can and there are hedgerows wherever the grower is interested in planting hedgerows, but like what if we could really think of connecting these landscapes via kind of cover crops between the rows? I think that would be amazing. I also focus a little bit on pollinators and fire, and so hopefully Jim Rivers and I can hang out and even though those fires were absolutely horrible and led to the worst air quality I've ever experienced, even as a Californian, they might have some really interesting bees that come back into them. So kind of the bees and fire angle. And we have another project in the Southwest that we just got funded from the NSF, looking at the kind of island biogeography of bees in high elevation meadows. So that'll be really exciting.
Cool.
Yeah. So I'm going to transition over slowly, but
Yeah.
there's lots of great bees up here. And, one thing I've got to say, just from being in Oregon for a couple months during a pandemic, I have met so many people that I'm like, oh, I work on bees. And then they're just so excited about it in a way that I did not experience in Southern California or experienced somewhat, but not at this level. And so I really appreciate how, of course, many of you are not from Oregon, but I just really appreciate people who care about bees right now, and they really need it. So thank you for coming to this talk.
Well, thanks for you coming. Yeah, honestly, Oregon is pretty amazing. We have phenomenal people all over the state, and they're doing a lot of great work here. Can I get you to stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
And I'll throw up the outro slides. So don't you all run off right now. Well, thank you so much, Lauren. That was fantastic. I have a new found appreciation for both sunflowers and bee toilets.
That's my goal. Thank you.
I'll never look at flowers the same again. So for you folks that are still here, if you're interested in learning more about native bees, please consider joining the Master Melitologist program. The Master Melitologist program is hard to say, and it's a Master Gardener type program where you'll learn how to contribute to the Oregon Bee Atlas, meaning you'll get to go on fun bee hunting adventures. The program provides extensive learning opportunities about native bees, as you might imagine. And you'll have the opportunity to go on bee research adventures, frolic in a conservation-minded manner in wildflower meadows, and contribute towards native bee conservation while making amazing discoveries with all your new friends at the Oregon Bee Atlas. Of course, projects like the Atlas are supported by grants and especially by donations, so please consider giving a gift to the Oregon Bee Atlas at any level by visiting our website where we have a Donate Now button, or you can contact us to discuss endowments. When you leave, I hope you'll be prompted by a really short survey that's just going to ask you what you'd like to learn about on the wild world of bees. So take a minute to let us know. And thank you for tuning in. We'll see you in December. Good night.